The last thing Sloane said to me in that conference room, before the whole thing came down on her head, was that I never built a single thing in my life. That I had lived off my dead husband's money for 40 years, like some kind of leech. She was on her feet when she said it, pointing one long manicured finger across a table that could seat 20. And behind her, the rest of the family sat lined up like a jury that had already made up its mind about me. So I set my coffee down, and I stood up too. And I let her keep believing every word of it for about 10 more seconds. Because those were the last 10 seconds she was ever going to feel like she had won. My name is Corinne Kessler. I am 66 years old. And that company they all thought their daddy built, the one he sold for a small fortune, the one that paid for every truck and every hunting lease sitting in that room. I built it. In a barn. In 1985. With my own two hands and my own name on the patent. A name not one of them ever bothered to learn. Let me tell you how they found out. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments. And please, stay with me until the end. Because to understand how a woman like me ended up holding every card at that table, you have to go back further than that conference room. You have to go back to the worst day of my life. Not the day I learned what this family really thought of me. The day before that. The day we put Ellis in the ground. The Kessler Ranch sits about 20 minutes outside Fredericksburg, out where the good pavement gives up and the Kalish Road takes over, white and dusty and hard on a car's suspension. We had 140 acres of hill country out there, live oaks older than the state of Texas. A stand of peach trees Ellis planted the first spring we were married, and in April the low pastures went blue with bluebonnets, so thick you could smell them from the porch. The house was limestone, walls 2 feet deep, a tin roof that sang when it rained. I walked into that house as a young woman, and I fully intended to walk out of it feet first. An old one. Funny how sure a person can be about a thing. We buried Ellis on a Thursday, under a sky so blue and so empty it felt like an insult. The church was the little Methodist one his mother used to drag him to as a boy, and it was packed. Because Ellis Kessler was the kind of man who filled a room whether he meant to or not. 40 years I was married to that man. 40 years of his laugh, his terrible jokes, his habit of leaving the truck running while he ran back inside for something he forgot. And now the truck was quiet, and so was the house, and so was I. Everybody kept telling me what a devoted wife I had been. They said it at the graveside, and they said it again at the reception, holding my hands in both of theirs, telling me how I had nursed that man through his last hard year without one word of complaint. Bless their hearts. If they had known the half of what I carried in that marriage, and for how long, they would have needed to sit down. The reception was back at the ranch, and that is where I started to notice things. You would think grief would have made me blind. It did the opposite. It made me see everything. Ellis had 3 children from his first marriage to a woman named Diane, who left him a long time before I ever came along. Diane herself showed up to the funeral, silver-haired now and gracious, and said something kind about the man who had once walked out on her, which turned out to be more grace than any of his own children could manage before the day was over. The oldest was Garrett, 49, who ran a construction outfit over in Bowen and wore the kind of watch a man buys when he is trying to look like money he does not actually have. Twice that afternoon, I watched him slip out to the back porch with his phone pressed hard against his ear, shoulders up around his neck, hissing at somebody I would have bet the ranch was his accountant. Garrett had that cornered look on him. I knew it well. I had seen it on men right before they did something stupid. Then there was Bridget, 46, and her husband Trent Doyle, who sold real estate down through the hill country and never once met a piece of land he did not silently appraise. I caught the two of them by the front window doing exactly that to my own house. Trent's eyes running along the ceiling beams like he was already writing the listing in his head. Bridget had her daddy's mouth and not one drop of his warmth. And then there was Emmett, the youngest, 43. And to explain why Emmett was different from the rest of them, I have to tell you something. When Ellis and I first got together, Emmett was 2 years old. 2. His mother was long gone and his daddy was out on the road selling half the time. So the plain truth is, I did not marry into being Emmett's stepmother. I became his mother, the only one that boy ever really had. I taught him to read and to drive and to throw a curveball that actually curved. And on the day we buried his father, he was the only one of them who crossed the room to ask how I was holding up and then stood there and waited for the answer. He kept a little apart from the others the whole afternoon, like some part of him already knew what was coming and could not stand next to it. And then there was Sloane, Emmett's wife. He married her 4 years back, and from the very first Sunday supper she sat through at my table, that woman looked at me like I was a stain on the good china. Sloane Pruitt, before she was a Kessler. Pretty in a hard, expensive way, the kind of pretty that costs a fortune to keep up. She spent that whole reception drifting through my house with a glass of my wine in her hand, trailing one finger along my mantle, easing open the doors of my hutch, tilting her head at my rooms like a woman deciding which walls she was fixing to knock out. She was not grieving, not for 1 second. She was measuring. And here is the thing that tied every one of them together that afternoon. The thing I could feel humming under all the hugs and the casseroles. They were waiting. For years, those children had told anybody who would sit still that their daddy had built a real company, Kessler Controls, and sold it off to a big outfit up in Houston for a pile of money nobody would ever put a number to. They had been counting that money in their heads for a solid decade, waiting on it, planning around it. Garrett with his drowning business, Bridget with her appetites, Sloane with whatever she meant to turn my ranch into. As far as every last one of them knew, their father had died a rich man, and now it was Christmas morning. Not one of them had the first idea whose money it actually was. The last of the guests trickled out a little after 8, and I found myself alone in the kitchen with a sink full of other people's plates, my hands moving on their own, while the rest of me tried to remember how a person breathes. That is where I was, elbow deep in the dishwater, when I heard them come in behind me. Not one set of footsteps. Several, slow and deliberate, the kind that get talked over in another room first before anybody walks anywhere. Well, Sloane said, that is that then. I did not turn around right away. I said thank you for helping with everything, that Ellis would have loved the turnout. I kept my hands in the water. You can drop the grieving widow routine. Corinne, she said, we need to talk about something practical. I dried my hands and I turned around. There they were, Sloane out front, arms crossed, still in her black dress but done pretending to mourn in it. Garrett off one shoulder, Bridget off the other, the three of them arranged like a firing squad that had already loaded. And back by the doorway, half out in the hall like he wanted to be anywhere on God's earth but there, stood Emmett. My Emmett, not looking at me. What practical matters, I asked. This house, Sloane said. Dad's assets. The estate. She said each word slow and flat, like she was walking a slow child through the concept of money. Garrett and Bridget and I have talked it through, and we think the kindest thing, given your age, is for you to start looking into other arrangements. I asked her what in the world she meant by arrangements. She meant a home is what she meant, though she was too polished to say the word straight off. She went on about how the ranch was an awful lot of house for one old woman, how the upkeep alone would eat me alive, how there were some real nice senior communities down in Kerrville, full of people my own age with somebody on staff to look in on me. Assisted living, like I was a hazard that needed handling before I went and hurt myself. You never worked a day in your life, Sloane said, warming up now, getting mean the way people do when they are certain they have already won. Dad carried you for 40 years. This house, that car, every stitch you have got on your back, all of it was his success. You were just along for the ride, honey. And now the ride is over. And it is high time somebody was realistic with you about whose name is on what. I looked past her at Emmett. And I want you to understand that I gave that boy every last chance in the world right then. I looked at him and I waited for him to remember who taught him to drive on the Kalashich Road out front, who sat up the whole night he burned with fever at 6 years old. He kept his eyes down on the floor tile like it was the most fascinating thing in all of Gillespie County. So I turned back to the sink and I said the only thing there was left to say. Okay. The quiet that came after that was a beautiful thing to hear. I do believe they had braced themselves for a fight, for screaming, for me down on my knees begging, for some ugly scene they could point to later and tell themselves I had earned every bit of what was coming. Instead, I just said okay and went right back to rinsing a wine glass. And the silence stretched out and got worse by the second until Sloane finally said, "Well, good. That was very mature of me," in a voice that had lost every bit of its footing. I packed that night, after they had gone off to carve up my life in the living room, in those excited little whispers people use when they think nobody who counts can hear them. I packed 2 suitcases, just the two. Everything else, the jewelry, the good clothes, the paintings on the walls that Sloane had been pricing with her eyes all afternoon, I left right where it hung. Let them think that was the whole of what I was walking out with. An old woman with 2 bags and a head full of memories, headed off to a home in Kerrville to sit quiet and wait for the end. They had no earthly idea what they had just done. Because here is what none of them knew. Standing in my kitchen 12 hours after I buried my husband, telling me to get out of my own house. The deed to that ranch did not have Ellis Kessler's name anywhere on it. It had mine. It always had. And Lord help them. That was the smallest secret I had been keeping. I switched off the kitchen light, listened to that old house settle around me one last time, and let myself smile just a little there in the dark. Tomorrow, my real life was going to start. And theirs. Well, theirs was fixing to get complicated. I left the ranch a little after sunrise, before a single one of them was up to watch me go. I did not point that car toward Kerrville, and I did not go looking at any brochure for any home with a nice lady on staff to look in on me. I drove into Fredericksburg, down Main Street, past the shops still shuttered for the morning, and turned off onto a quiet side street to a little limestone casita I had owned for going on 11 years. Rented it out to summer folks most seasons. It sat empty just then. There was a key to it on my ring, for a house not one soul in that family knew belonged to me. And I let myself in and set my 2 suitcases down on the pine floor, and I will be honest with you, I laughed. Not a happy laugh. More the laugh of a woman who has just been told to go find herself somewhere to live by, people standing in the middle of one of the smallest things she owns. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and I made the first of the phone calls that were going to burn that family's whole world to the ground. Harlan Voss picked up on the second ring. Harlan had been my lawyer for 31 years. Not Ellis's lawyer. Mine. Now the family, they had seen Harlan around over the decades, at closings and the odd Christmas, and every last one of them had filed him away as Dad's attorney, the fella who handled Dad's business. And I had been more than happy to let them think exactly that. The truth was that Harlan Voss had spent 3 decades quietly, minding the affairs of a woman they did not believe had any affairs to mind. "Corinne," he said, and I could hear him already reaching for his keys. "I am so sorry about Ellis. He was a good man." "He was," I said. "And Harlan, I am going to need you to drive out here today." There was a little pause, the kind Harlan takes when he already knows the answer to the question he is fixing to ask. "The family," he said. "The family," I said. He told me to sit tight and put on some coffee. He would be there inside the hour. And while I waited on him, let me tell you the part of this story that not one person at that funeral knew. The part that matters. I was born in 1960 to a machinist named Roy Adair, out in a nothing little town where the wind never quit. My daddy could fix or build any blessed thing you put in front of him, and he did not have any sons. So I was the one who stood at his elbow in that shop from the time I could hold a wrench. I knew the smell of cutting oil before I knew my letters. I loved it. And when the counselor at my high school laughed out loud at a girl saying she wanted to be an engineer, I decided right then and there I would show every one of them. And in 1982, I walked across a stage with a mechanical engineering degree in my hand, and just about the whole auditorium wondering how in the world that happened. I took a job at an oil field valve shop, junior design engineer, which is a fancy way of saying I did the drawings the men did not feel like doing. And in the fall of 1984, there was an accident out at a workover site west of here. A surface safety valve failed on a live well. A man named Cordell, 30 years old, with a wife and a baby at home, did not walk away from it. And they sent the drawings across my desk after to file, and I sat there and I saw it, plain as day. A flaw in the way that valve was built to fail. It was supposed to shut itself in when everything else went to hell. Instead, it did the opposite, and a young man died for it. I could not put it down. I went home and I designed a better one. A fail-safe surface valve that could not do what that one did, no matter what went wrong upstream. I sat in the barn out on a rundown place I had bought with the little bit of money my daddy left me when he passed. 140 acres of played-out hill country nobody else wanted. And I built the first one by hand out there under a hanging bulb. And I tested it. And by God, it worked. And then I ran headfirst into the wall. Because it was 1985, and I was a 25-year-old woman. And the men who bought equipment for those oil companies were not about to write a check to some girl for the safety gear that stood between their roughnecks and a fireball. I sat across the desk from purchasing agent after purchasing agent, and I watched them look at me and decide, before I even opened my mouth, that whatever I was selling could not be worth a damn. It was not against the law, what they did. Nobody could point at it. It was just the way the whole world was built back then, and that wall was every bit as real as if it had been poured out of concrete. Now this is where Ellis comes in, and I want you to hear me clearly, because how you understand this next part decides whether you understand my husband at all. I met Ellis Kessler at a supply company barbecue in the spring of 1985. He was 33 years old, freshly on his own with 3 little ones after a marriage that had come apart. And he was, hands down, the finest natural salesman I ever laid eyes on. That man could sell water to a drowning fella and have him thanking Ellis for the privilege. And I looked at him, and I looked at that wall I could not get over. And I did a thing that a lot of folks even now cannot make sense of. I made him the front of it. I did not marry Ellis Kessler for his money. Lord, he did not have any. I married him because between the two of us, we've made one whole thing that the world of 1985 was actually willing to do business with. I was the mind. He was the face. We named it Kessler Controls because his name would open a door mine would not, and because it was fixing to be my name too. And the patent, the one on that valve that is still keeping men alive on rigs from here to the Permian, I filed it in 1986 under the name C. Adair, and I assigned it to the company. And not one of Ellis's children ever thought to go pull it and read whose name was really on it. Ellis knew. Do not you ever think he did not. He walked into every one of those meetings and shook every one of those hands and closed every one of those deals. And he was worth his weight in gold at it. And he came home to me every night knowing whose company he was the face of. It was our deal. It was an honest deal between two people who loved each other, made in a world that would not give a woman like me a fair shake. And he carried the credit in public, and I carried it in the accounts. And we both of us knew the truth of it in the dark. 30 years we ran that company, grew it from a barn to a real plant with better than 150 employees. And in 2016, a big outfit up in Houston called Meridian Industrial bought Kessler Controls, and the money from that sale, all of it, came home to me, to the trust. And the whole hill country simply understood that Ellis Kessler had built himself a fine company and cashed out and retired. And I let them understand it, same as always. Every dollar those children had been counting in their heads for 10 years was mine. Every acre, and they did not have the first idea. Harlan pulled up the caliche little after 9. He is a lean old rail of a man, must be near 70 now, with reading glasses forever shoved up on top of his head, and a leather case that has seen more family greed than any one man ought to have to. I poured him coffee, and we sat at that little pine table, and I told him everything that had happened in the kitchen the night before. His jaw got tighter the longer I talked. When I got to the part about assisted living, he set his cup down hard enough to slop. They actually said that to you, he said. In your own house. The night you buried him. They surely did, I said. Harlan opened his case and started laying it out on the table. And though I knew every word of it already, there is a certain kind of peace a person gets from hearing a good lawyer say it plain. It is all in the trust, Corinne, he said. It has been for years. The ranch, the accounts, the Meridian money, every bit of it sits inside your revocable living trust and has since long before Ellis ever got sick. He tapped the folder. Ellis had one thing, he said, a lifetime right to live in that house. Not to own it, to live in it, for as long as he drew breath. That right died the minute he did. On paper, the estate those children are in there carving up right now is worth just about enough to bury him and settle his truck note. There it was, said out loud. So the house they threw me out of, I said, was never for one day theirs to throw you out of, Harlan said. It is yours. It always was. He looked at me over the top of those reading glasses. You could evict all 3 of them today, Corinne. I could have a notice on that door by supper. Say the word. And that was the moment I had a choice to make. And I want to be square with you about it, because I am not going to sit here and paint myself a saint. Part of me wanted exactly that. Wanted Harlan to go nail that paper to my own front door while Sloan was still measuring my curtains. But there is a difference between what a thing costs you and what it teaches you. And I had spent one long night learning something about these people that I could not unlearn, and I found I wanted to see the rest of it. I wanted them good and comfortable first, settled in, deep into their plans, spending money in their heads that was never theirs, showing me all the way down to the bottom exactly who they were. Not yet, I told Harlan. Give them a little rope. Let them get comfortable. He nodded slow, and I do believe he understood, because he had seen me be patient about far smaller things than this. After he left, I could not help myself. I drove out past the ranch, just the once. I pulled onto the shoulder a good ways down the caliche, where the live oaks would hide the car, and I looked at my own house through the trees. And there was a moving truck backed up to my porch. A great big rental truck, ramped down, and men in work gloves carrying furniture that was not mine up my front steps. Sloan stood out in the yard in sunglasses, pointing like a foreman running a job site, waving one arm at the barn and the other at my flower beds. And there was a fella beside her with a tablet nodding at every word, some designer she had already hired. And behind them I could see my daddy's roses, the ones I had babied along for 15 years, already dug up and thrown in a pile by the fence. She was not helping settle Ellis's affairs. She was moving in. For good. Turning my ranch into whatever she had been telling her friends it was fixing to be. I did not honk. I did not roll down the window. I just sat there in the shade a minute, watching that woman rearrange a life she had not the slightest idea did not belong to her. And then I put the car in gear and drove back to town. Let her dig up every rose. Let her spend every dollar in her head. She was standing in the middle of my land, dividing up my company, planning her big future on top of a fortune with my maiden name buried at the bottom of it. And the harder she planned, the further she was going to fall. Because Sloan Pruitt was about to make a mistake with that ranch that no amount of my money was ever going to fix. And she was fixing to drag every one of them down into it with her. They gave me about 3 days of quiet, and then the phone started buzzing like a wasp in a jar. Sloan called first, then Garrett, then Sloan again, then Bridget, then a number I did not know that turned out to be Bridget, calling from Trent's phone when I quit picking up her own. I let every one of them roll to voicemail, and I listened to the messages in the evenings with a glass of wine, the way other folks watch their programs. The tone of them changed real fast over those 3 days. Monday, they were still ordering me around. By Wednesday, there was a crack in it. They had gone through Ellis's study out at the ranch, pulled every drawer, cracked open the fire safe, and what they found in there did not add up to what they had been promised their whole lives. Sloane's last message said they had come across some confusing paperwork, and there were things I was going to need to explain. Confusing. I could only imagine. Old outdated copies Ellis kept around for show, referencing a company that had not been his to sell, and money that had never landed in his name. They were getting nervous. Good. Let them. But the two calls that mattered that week were not to me at all. They were to Harlan. And that right there is the part where they stopped just embarrassing themselves and started digging a hole they could not climb out of. The first one came from a lawyer up in Austin, representing an outfit called Bluestem Venue Partners. Now, if you have spent any time in this country, you know the wedding business out here is a gold mine. Folks drive in from Dallas and Houston to get married under the live oaks and pay a fortune for the privilege. And Fredericksburg has turned into the beating heart of it. And it turned out that little Sloane, before Ellis was even cold, had gotten way ahead of herself. She had signed a letter of intent with Bluestem to turn my barn and my south pasture into an event venue, had put down earnest money on the deal, real money. And she had been out telling everybody who would hold still, friends, her folks, a couple of investors she was trying to pull in, that she was about to open the finest wedding venue in the hill country on her late father-in-law's estate. There was just the one problem. Bluestem was fixing to sink a pile of capital into that property, and no serious company does that without running a title search first, to make good and sure the person signing the papers actually owns the dirt. So their lawyer pulled the title, and the title did not say Sloane Kessler. It did not say the estate of Ellis Kessler. It said the Corinne A. Kessler Living Trust, and it listed Harlan Voss as trustee. So their lawyer picked up the phone and called Harlan to sort out the discrepancy, polite as you please. And Harlan, bless that man, let him talk, listened to the whole thing, then explained, real slow and clear, that the woman who signed their letter of intent did not own so much as a fence post out there, and that his client, the actual owner, had not authorized 1 square inch of it. Sloane had signed a contract and spent earnest money on land that was mine, and she had done it loud, in front of the whole county. The second call was worse, and it came from family. Garrett drove down to Harlan's office himself, midweek, having decided in his infinite wisdom that Dad's lawyer was the man to see about getting his hands on some of Dad's money a little early. See, Garrett still thought Harlan worked for Ellis. They all did. So Garrett sat down across that desk and, trying to sound like a man in control, asked whether there was any way to get an advance against his share of the estate. Said he had a cash flow situation. And the more Harlan let him talk, the more of it came spilling out, because Garrett was scared and scared men run their mouths. Turned out Garrett's construction company had been drowning for the better part of 2 years. And a few months back, betting on this inheritance he was so sure was coming, he had taken out a bridge loan to keep the doors open. A big one. And here is the part that made me sick to my stomach even as it handed me everything. Garrett had signed a personal guarantee on that loan, which means when it comes due and the company cannot pay, it is not just the company that goes under. It is Garrett, his house, his trucks, everything he has got, on the line, all of it propped up on his share of a ranch he was never going to inherit one blade of grass of. Harlan called me that night and laid it all out, and I sat there at that little pine table in the dark for a long while after we hung up, because I want to be straight with you about something, and I have been trying to be straight with you this whole time. Up until that phone call, this had felt like a game I was winning. A hard, cold game, but a game. They had been cruel to me, and they were about to look like fools. And there is a part of every one of us that likes to watch a bully get theirs. But sitting in that dark kitchen, I understood for the first time that this was not going to stop at fools. Sloane was going to lose real money and get herself sued for signing over land she did not own. And Garrett, weak, prideful, drowning Garrett, was going to lose his whole life. Not because I was going to reach out and take it from him, but because I was simply going to stop pretending, and everything he had stacked on top of a lie was going to come down on its own. I could have warned him. I want you to sit with that, because I did. I could have picked up the phone right then and told Garrett to get out from under that loan before it was too late. I did not owe him one thing on God's earth. He had stood in my kitchen and watched his wife throw me out, but he was still a man I had watched grow up, and I lay awake that night deciding whether saving him was mercy or just letting him keep on being who he was at everybody else's expense. I decided I was not going to destroy them. But I was not going to rescue them from themselves either. There is a canyon of difference between those two things, and every soul in that family was about to learn where the edge of it was. So I quit waiting. I called Harlan the next morning and told him to bring in Camille Ashford. Camille was the piece the family had never once laid eyes on. Harlan was my counsel, quiet and steady. But Harlan was 70 years old and he did trusts, not knife fights. Camille Ashford did knife fights. She was maybe 50, tall, sharp as a fresh blade, one of the best litigators in the state of Texas. And when she walked into a room, people sat up straighter without quite knowing why. I had put her on retainer years back for exactly a day like the one I could feel coming. And when I told her the whole story, start to finish, she got a small, still smile on her face that I have only ever seen on people who are very good at their work and are about to get to do it. They gave us the perfect opening, too. The family, still tearing that study apart, looking for a fortune that was not there, had by then convinced themselves of the only thing their pride would let them believe, that I had hidden it, that the grieving old widow had somehow squirreled Dad's money away where they could not find it. So they hired themselves a lawyer, a soft, nervous fella named Whitfield, and had him send Harlan a formal demand. They wanted a full accounting of the estate. They wanted every beneficiary in one room to go through it line by line. And they wanted me there, in person, so they could look me in the eye while they pried loose what they were owed. They were summoning me to a meeting to expose me. Camille read that letter and just about laughed. "Oh," she said, "we will absolutely attend." The meeting was set for the following Tuesday, 2 in the afternoon, at their lawyer's office in a low brick building off the highway. I dressed for it careful that morning, not the way a beat-down widow dresses. A charcoal suit that fit me like it was cut for me, because it was. My grandmother's pearls, and the good watch Ellis gave me for our 10th anniversary, back when we still had to think about what things cost. I wanted to walk in looking like precisely what I was, a woman of substance who had chosen, for 40 years and her own good reasons, to be underestimated. I got there 15 minutes early, Harlan on one side of me, Camille on the other, the two of them carrying cases full of paper that was fixing to end the argument for good. And I could hear the family before I ever saw them, their voices leaking out from down the hall. Sloane going on about how I did not even belong at this meeting, how I was not a real heir to anything, and their nervous lawyer trying to talk her down. The receptionist, a girl who could not have been 25, looked me over when I gave my name and filed me away, same as everybody always had. Just some little old lady in pearls. At 2 o'clock, they walked us back to a conference room built for a lot more people than it needed to hold. One long table you could have landed a plane on. And there they were, all lined up down one side of it like a jury that had already voted. Sloane at the head, because of course she was. Garrett and Bridget flanking her, Trent hovering behind, and Emmett down at the far end, a little apart from the rest, staring at his hands, the same as he had the night in the kitchen. Their lawyer sat across from us, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief. He cleared his throat and started reading. The estate of Ellis Kessler, the formal language, the sound mind, the small bequests to the church. And then he got to the numbers. and I watched every face on that side of the table as he said them. There was a modest amount in a personal checking account, a truck paid off, some tools and personal effects, and the whole of it, once you settled his final expenses, came to a little under $300,000 to be divided equally among his 3 children, around $100,000 apiece, give or take. The silence that dropped over that room was a thing you could have reached out and touched. Then it broke. Sloane came up out of her chair so fast it rolled back and hit the wall, one finger already pointed across the table at me, her voice climbing high and ugly. "That is a lie," she said. "Where is the rest of it? Where is the company money? She never built a single thing in her life. She lived off his money for 40 years like a leech, and now she is hiding what is ours." And I set my coffee down, and I stood up. I stood there and let the whole room look at me a good long moment. Every eye down that side of the table waiting on the old widow to either come apart or come out swinging, and I gave them neither one. I gave them something a great deal worse. I agreed with her. "You are right, Sloane," I said. Real quiet, almost kind. "I never built one single thing that Ellis Kessler built. Not the company. Not the name. Not $1 of that money you have all been counting in your sleep. That was Ellis. Every bit of it. I had nothing to do with any of it." And I watched the confusion move down that line of faces, because that was not the fight they had gotten dressed up for. Sloane's finger came down a couple of inches. Garrett squinted at me like I had started talking in a language he did not know. "But here is the thing," I said. "Ellis Kessler's estate is not what you think it is. And neither, God help you, am I." That was Camille's cue, and Camille Ashford had been waiting on it the way a hawk waits on a field mouse. She opened her case without any hurry at all and laid the first document out on that long table and slid it across the wood, and it came to rest right in front of Sloane with a little whisper that filled up the whole quiet room. "That," Camille said, "is the deed to the property at the Kessler Ranch. The house you have been living in these past 2 weeks. I would draw your attention to the name of the owner." Sloane picked it up. I watched the color go out of her face line by line as she read it. It said the Corinne A. Kessler Living Trust. It had said that since 2011, "This is wrong," she said, but her voice had gone thin. "He owned that ranch before he ever met her." "He did not," Camille said, easy as anything. "Mrs. Kessler bought that 140 acres in 1984, before she and Ellis ever laid eyes on each other, with money her father left her. Ellis Kessler held a lifetime right to live in that house. Nothing more. That right ended the day he passed. Which means," Camille said, and she let it sit there, "that every one of you has been residing on Mrs. Kessler's private property, without her permission, for a little over 2 weeks now." Bridget snatched the deed out of Sloane's hands and read it herself, mouth moving, and Trent leaned over her shoulder, and I watched the real estate drain right out of that man's eyes. Then Camille laid down the next one, and the next. Bank statements, brokerage accounts, a list of holdings that made Ellis's little checking account look like the change in a boy's pocket. And the family sat there and watched a fortune they had never dreamed of get dealt out across that table like a losing hand. "In 2016, Camille said, a company called Kessler Controls was acquired by Meridian Industrial out of Houston." She set down the last page. "The proceeds of that sale, in their entirety, were paid to Mrs. Kessler's trust. Net of taxes," she said. "The sum came to just under $80 million. $80 million. The number dropped on that room like a transformer blowing. Nobody breathed. Bridget made a little sound like she had been hit in the stomach. Garrett had gone gray as ditch water, and I knew, watching his face, that he was not doing the same arithmetic as everybody else. Everybody else was thinking about what they had lost. Garrett was thinking about a personal guarantee on a bridge loan and a share of an inheritance that had just turned into $300,000 split 3 ways, and he was watching his whole life come down in real time. Then Camille laid down the last page, and this was the one I had waited 40 years to see hit that table. For the record, Camille said, I would like to correct one statement made earlier in this meeting. The claim that Mrs. Kessler never built anything. She turned the page around so it faced them. This is the original United States patent, filed in 1986, on a fail-safe surface safety valve. The design that Kessler Controls was founded on. The design Meridian paid $80 million to acquire. I would ask everyone to read the name of the inventor. They read it. Corinne Adair. Adair, Camille said, into the silence as Mrs. Kessler's maiden name. Ellis Kessler is not listed anywhere on that patent. He could not be. He did not design it. He did not engineer it. And he could not have. Mrs. Kessler did. In the barn. On the ranch. In 1985. She founded the company. He was the salesman. I stood up out of my chair. Slow so they could all watch me do it. I let you believe he built it, I said, and I looked at every one of them in turn. All these people who had put me out of my own house 12 hours after I buried my husband. For 40 years, I let you and this whole county believe Ellis Kessler was some kind of genius. Because in 1985, there was not a purchasing agent in the state of Texas who would buy a safety valve off a 25-year-old woman. And Ellis and I made a choice about that together. He carried the name so the doors would open. I carried the company. And your father knew exactly whose company it was every single day of his life. And he loved me for it, which is more than one of you managed in 20 years. Sloan had nothing left. She sat there opening and closing her mouth. You called me a leech, I said. You stood in my kitchen and told me I never worked a day in my life. Honey, I have signed the front of more paychecks than you have ever seen the back of. I did not force any one of you to throw me out. I did not make you measure my curtains before my husband was cold. You did all of that on your own, and all I ever did was let you show me who you were. Then Camille slid one last thing across the table, and this one was not evidence. It was a notice to vacate, drawn up proper, with all three of their names on it. You have to the end of the month, Camille said, to remove your belongings from Mrs. Kessler's property. That is more time than the law requires, and it is a courtesy, not a right. If you are not out by then, we will file for eviction, and the constable will handle the rest. I would encourage you not to make us do that. Their nervous lawyer had quit even trying to talk. There was nothing for him to say. I picked up my purse and I looked at them one last time, and Sloan, drowning, reached for the only thing she had left. Corinne, please, she said, and her voice cracked all the way open. We can work something out. We are family. I stopped at the door. I did not turn all the way around. We are, I said. And you spent the last 2 weeks teaching me exactly how much that word is worth to you. I am just returning the lesson. And I walked out of there and left them sitting in the wreckage. Now, I would love to tell you, I felt nothing but sweet satisfaction driving home that afternoon. I have been honest with you this whole way, and I am not fixing to quit now. What I mostly felt was tired, bone tired, and sad and old. Because whatever those people were, they were the closest thing to a family I had left. And I had just watched the last of it burn down in a brick conference room off the highway. And no amount of money in any trust in the world was going to fill up the quiet waiting for me back at that casita. Except the quiet had something in it that evening I was not expecting. Harlan had followed me back to town, and when I came in, he was sitting at the little pine table with an envelope in front of him, and his face was not a lawyer's face just then. It was an old friend's. Ellis left this with me, he said. His instructions were that I was to hold it and give it to you once the estate was settled and you had, and Harlan chose his words careful, once you had seen the family clearly. He slid it across. I would say you have, Corinne. My name was on the front of it in Ellis's terrible handwriting. That man could close $1 million deal and never in his life learn to make a legible letter G. I sat down and I opened it. And I want to tell you what my husband wrote to me from the other side of the grave, because it changed how I understood every single thing that had happened. He knew. That is the first thing. Corey, he wrote, and he was the only soul on earth ever allowed to call me that. If you are reading this, then I am gone and the vultures have shown up. And I'm so sorry I am not there to run them off myself. I set the trust up the way I did on purpose. You know that, but I never told you the whole of why. So here it is. I did it because I know my own children. I love them. God help me. But I have watched them my whole life, and I know that the day I am not standing between you and them, some of them are going to come for you. I could not stop that, but I could make good and sure that when they did, they came at a stone wall. I sat there in that kitchen and I cried like I had not cried at the funeral. Give them what they earned, he wrote, and not one dime more. You do not owe them your kindness. You already gave them more of it than they ever knew. And then the last line, the one I read about 40 times. But keep an eye on the one who kept a soft heart, Corey. You know which one. He is going to need his mama before this is through. And whatever the rest of them do, do not you let him go. You know which one. I did. Of course I did. And I sat there a long while in the dark, with my dead husband's letter in my hands, understanding for the first time that this thing was not over, not by a long shot. Because there was still one of them out there that Ellis had all but reached back from the grave to hand me. And I had no idea yet what it was going to take to get him back. The month they had to clear off my ranch turned out to be the longest 30 days of their lives, and I did not have to lift a finger to make it that way. I just quit carrying the weight of them, and the whole thing came down right on schedule. I heard most of it secondhand, and in a county like this one, secondhand is a fire hose. Nothing stays quiet out here. The feed store hears about your troubles before your own mama does. Sloane's wedding venue was the first thing to go, and it went ugly. Once Bluestem's lawyer got off the phone with Harlan and understood that the woman who had signed their letter of intent did not own so much as a fence post of the land she had signed over, that deal died where it stood. But it did not die clean. Sloane had put earnest money down on it, and not all of it was hers. Some of it belonged to a couple of folks around town she had sweet-talked into coming in on her big idea. And when the whole thing came apart, those folks wanted their money back. And one of them, a man who had put in a good deal more than he could afford to lose, got himself an attorney and started using the word fraud, because Sloane had looked him dead in the eye and represented to him that she owned an estate that was mine. Her earnest money was gone. Her investors were out for blood. And the finest wedding venue in the hill country, the one she had bragged about at every luncheon from here to Kerrville, turned straight to smoke. And every soul who had heard her crow about it got a front row seat to watch it burn. Garrett went down quieter and a whole lot harder. That bridge loan he had signed a personal guarantee on, betting the entire thing on an inheritance that had just shrunk to $100,000, came due with nothing standing behind it. The bank does not care about a man's feelings. When the money he had promised them dried up, so did their patience. And a personal guarantee means exactly what those two words say. It was not just the construction company on the hook anymore. It was Garrett, his house over in Bourne, his trucks, that watch he wore to look like money he did not have. All of it lined up behind a debt that $100,000 was not going to make a dent in. Bridget and Trent did not lose as loud, but they lost too. Trent had been out telling clients he had a big development play coming, a whole spread out past Fredericksburg he was going to get his hands on. And now there was no spread and no play, and a lot of people wondering what happened to it. The two of them had been living a few years ahead of themselves the way that kind of couple does, and the check they had been spending in their heads was never coming. And here is the part I did not see coming, and it is the part that tells you everything about that family. They did not turn on me. Not really. They turned on each other. Because once the shock wore off and the ruin settled in, they all needed somewhere to put it, and every last one of them put it on Sloane. Garrett and Bridget decided, in that way scared people do, that if Sloane had not been so brazen about the whole thing, none of this would have gone the way it did. If she had not dug up my roses and moved her furniture in before her father-in-law was cold, if she had not signed that venue deal loud and public and put the whole county on notice, if she had not stood in my kitchen and called me a leech to my face and burned down whatever small mercy I might have had in me. In their minds, she had lit the match. It did not matter that the trust was a stone wall, regardless of anything she did. People who are drowning do not want the truth. They want somebody to hold under. And Sloane was the one bobbing closest. I drove out to the ranch on the last day of the month. I told myself it was to make sure they had cleared out. But the truth is I wanted to see my house one more time before whatever came next. And some hard little part of me wanted to see how it ended. There were still 2 vehicles in my drive, and a rental trailer half loaded, and the front door was standing open, and I could hear them before I ever got up the steps. Not grieving, not planning, screaming. I let myself in. I still had my key, and it had never once occurred to a single one of them that the woman they threw out might walk right back through her own front door, because it had never occurred to them the door was hers. They were in the living room, in the middle of my emptied out house, and it was not a war council anymore. It was a knife fight. Bridget had Sloane backed against the wall by the fireplace, telling her she had cost them everything, that her greed and her big mouth had put the whole family in the poorhouse. Garrett was pacing, gray and wild-eyed, saying he was going to lose his house, his actual house. And where was Sloane's grand plan now? And Sloane was giving it right back, screeching that they had all been in on it, that they had all wanted the old woman gone, that she was not going to be the one holding the bag for a decision the whole family made together in this very room. Which was true, every word of it. But truth is a poor umbrella in that kind of rain. They did not even notice me at first. And then they did, all at once, the way a room goes quiet when the temperature drops. And every face turned toward the door where I stood with my keys in my hand. Nobody said get out this time. Wasn't a soul in that room with the standing to say it. And Sloane, cornered out of money and out of allies and out of road, did the last thing she had left to do. She turned to Emmett. He was over by the window, the same place he always stood, a little apart from all of it, and he had not said one word through the whole thing. And Sloane looked at him with something between fury and pleading and said, "Emmett, are you going to just stand there? Say something. Do something. She is your mother. She will listen to you. Fight for me." And I watched my boy look at his wife. Then I watched him look at me, and then back at her. And Emmett, who had stood silent in this same house a month ago while she threw me out, who had studied the floor tile like it held the secrets of the universe rather than lift his eyes to defend the woman who raised him, opened his mouth. "No," he said, real quiet. "I am not going to fight for you, Sloane. I stood by while you did this to her, and I have to live with that the rest of my life. I am not going to stand by while you make it worse." That was the sound of a marriage breaking. Right there in my living room, plain as a branch snapping in the cold. Sloane's face came apart. She had counted on that boy, the way you count on the ground being under your foot, and the ground was gone. I did not gloat. I want you to know that, because I have been honest with you the whole way, and I will not quit at the end. I stood in the doorway of my own emptied house and watched a family I had once belonged to tear itself to pieces, and I felt no triumph in it at all. I felt sick, and I felt sad, and mostly I felt old and tired and ready for them to be gone. "You have got until dark," I said. It was the only thing I said the whole time I was there. Then I turned around and walked back out to my car and sat in it and waited. And one by one they loaded the last of it and pulled out of my drive, down the Kalish Road, until the dust settled and the only sound left was the cicadas starting up in the heat. And then I went inside my house and I sat down in the middle of the empty living room floor, and I stayed there a long while. Now let me tell you about the quiet that came after, because the quiet is where the real story lives. And anybody who tells you of a story like mine, ends with the villain getting hers, is selling you something. The seasons turned, and I let them. I moved back into my ranch that summer, and the first thing I did, before I unpacked a single box, was drive to the nursery in town and buy new roses and plant them in the exact spot Sloan had torn my daddy's out and thrown them by the fence. My hands back in my own dirt, and slowly, over those long hot weeks, the tired went out of my bones, and in the evenings I would sit on my porch under my live oaks and drink my coffee and listen to my land and remember how to breathe. The grapevine kept me fed. Emmett and Sloan divorced before the leaves turned. Once he saw the whole of what she had done, and once the money she had married him for was gone, there was nothing holding that thing together, because there had never been anything but the money holding it together in the first place. She took what was left and moved on to whatever was next, and I did not waste 1 minute wondering where. Garrett lost the company, lost the house too. In the end, last I heard, he and his family were renting over in Kerrville, in one of those apartments not far from the senior community Sloan had been so eager to ship me off to, which is a kind of justice you could not write if you tried. He and Bridget both left me voicemails over those months, long, halting, sorry-sounding messages full of the word family and the word misunderstanding, calling me now that they had learned exactly who I was, now that I was no longer an old woman they could throw away. I listened to every one of them. I did not return a single one, not out of spite. I just did not have anything to say to people whose apology showed up the very minute they found out I had power, because that is not an apology at all. That is fear wearing an apology's coat, and I have been alive too long to mistake the one for the other. So I let those bridges stay burned, and I found I did not miss the crossing. But there was one number in my phone I kept looking at and not calling, and one voice on those voicemails I had not gotten, because that one had never called at all. Ellis's letter was still in the drawer of my kitchen table, and some nights I would take it out and read the last line of it again. Keep an eye on the one who kept a soft heart, Corey. You know which one. I did know. I had watched him break his own marriage in my living room rather than let it hurt me one more time. But knowing a thing and being ready for it are two different animals, and I was not in any hurry. I had time now, all the time in the world, and a whole ranch of quiet to spend it in. Justice was done, and I was not going to turn it into revenge by holding it over anybody's grave for the rest of my days. That is a poison, and it only ever kills the one holding the cup. So I waited, and on a cool morning that fall, with the peach leaves going gold, a truck I did not recognize came slow up my caliche road and stopped in front of my porch. And a man got out of it that I had raised from the time he was 2 years old, and he looked like he had not slept in a week, and he was carrying something in his hand. And I had no idea that my boy was about to hand me back the one secret I had carried the longest of all, the one thing not even he had ever known. I met him out on the porch. I did not go down the steps, and I did not open my arms, because a month ago in a brick conference room, I had drawn a line in this family and I was not about to smudge it, just because the one crossing it now was the one I loved. But I did not tell him to leave either. I stood at the top of my porch steps under the live oaks, and I let Emmett Kessler walk up to me on his own 2 feet, the way a man has to when he has something to answer for. He looked terrible, thinner than at the funeral, gray under the eyes, a man running on fumes and grief, and he was holding a manila folder against his chest, like it was the only solid thing in his whole world. Mama, he said. First word out of his mouth. Not Corinne. Mama. He had not called me that since he was a boy, and it about took my knees out from under me, but I kept my face still. I said, hello, Emmett. Real even. And I waited. It is Wren, he said, and his voice cracked clean in half on his little girl's name. She is sick, Mama. Real sick. There is something wrong with her heart, something she was born with, and they did not catch it until a few weeks ago. And now they are talking about surgery on a 3-year-old, and He stopped. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. I did not know where else to go, he said. I know I have got no right to be standing here. I know what we did to you. But I did not have anywhere else to go. and every hard thing I had been holding on to for a month, every wall I had built and meant to keep, cracked right down the middle. Because that was not Ellis' greedy son standing on my porch. That was the 2-year-old I had picked up and carried into this very house 41 years ago, grown into a father who was watching his own baby fight for her life. And there is not a line in the world hard enough to hold against that. I told him to sit down. I brought out coffee, and I sat next to my boy on the porch steps under the oaks, and I let him talk. He told me all of it, how they had found the heart defect, how the doctors up in San Antonio needed the whole family medical history to plan the surgery, every ancestor, every condition, going back as far as anybody could dig, and how Emmett, trying to be a good father in the one way that was left to him, had gone digging, pulled old records, called around, requested his own childhood files from a hospital that had long since changed hands, trying to find anything in the Kessler blood that might matter to his daughter's heart. And that, he said, is where I found this. And he handed me the folder. I did not have to open it. I knew what was in it before my fingers touched the flap, because it was the one thing I had carried longer and quieter than the company itself, longer and quieter than the trust, the one thing those children were never meant to find. But I opened it anyway, because he needed to watch me do it. Inside were the records from 1989, the year Emmett was 6 years old, the year he got so sick, so fast with an infection that went to his blood, that the doctors told Ellis and me to prepare ourselves. He needed a surgery that the little hospital here could not do, and that Ellis, back then, when Kessler Controls was still just 3 years old and every dollar we made went right back into the barn, could not begin to afford. There was no insurance that would cover it. There was a number, a big, terrible number, and there was a 6-year-old boy running out of time. And there was no way on God's earth for Ellis to bridge that gap, except there was. Because I had money Ellis did not yet know the full size of even then, money from the company that was quietly, in those days, just starting to be worth something, money in accounts under my maiden name. And I paid for it. All of it. I called that hospital in San Antonio myself and I wired the whole amount. And Ellis knew. Of course. He was standing right there in the hallway with me when they told us to prepare ourselves. But we told the doctors one thing, that the paperwork was to show the balance settled by an anonymous benefactor, and that the children were never to know where it truly came from. And it held. For 37 years it held. And those kids grew up believing their daddy had somehow found the money. And their daddy let them believe it, same as he let them believe everything else. Emmett was watching my face the whole time I read. It was you, he said. His voice was barely there. The surgery that saved my life when I was 6. The anonymous donor. There was never any donor. It was you. The whole time it was you. And everybody, my whole life, everybody always said Dad found a way. Dad took care of it. Dad was the hero. He looked at me like the ground had opened up. And it was you. And you never said one word. Not when I was a kid. Not when I got married. Not even a month ago, when you were standing in that kitchen, and I would not even look at you. You had that in your pocket the whole time, and you never used it. I told him the truth. I said, it was not a thing to be used, Emmett. I did not save your life to hold it over your head someday. I saved it because you were mine. You were mine from the day I carried you through that door, and a mother does not send a bill. And that grown man put his face in his hands on my porch steps and wept like the little boy I sat up with all those nights ago. And I put my arm around him same as I did back then. And we sat there a long while under the oaks while the peach leaves came down gold around us. When he could talk again, he asked me why. Not about the surgery, about the last month. Why, after everything, I had let him come up my drive at all. Why I was sitting here with my arm around him instead of watching him drown alongside the rest of them. And I told him one more thing, the last secret in the folder of my heart, and it was this. When Wren was born, 3 years back, I opened an account for that baby the same week she came home from the hospital. a college fund, quiet in trust with her name on it and nobody else's. I did it before any of this, before the funeral, before the kitchen, before Sloan ever measured my curtains. I did it back when I still thought this family was a family. And I never touched it and never closed it, not even the night they threw me out, because whatever her mother was, whatever her father did, that child never did one thing to me. My kindness to that little girl came before the betrayal. Emmett, I told him, it did not depend on any of you being good to me. It never did. He asked me, then what happens now? And that is the question the whole story had been walking toward. So let me tell you how I answered it, because it is the only part that matters. I said, here is what happens now. Ren is going to have the best surgeon in the state of Texas, and I have already made the calls. And you are never going to see a bill, and we are not going to discuss it again. That is not up for debate. That is a grandmother taking care of her grandbaby, and you are going to let me. But you and me, I said, and I made him look at me. We are going to do this different than before. I am not going to be the invisible woman anymore, Emmett. I am done making myself small so everybody around me can feel tall. I am not going to carry this fancy and let somebody else wear the credit. Those days died in that conference room. If you want your mama back, you can have her. But you are going to have all of me. The one who built a company in a barn and the one who signs the front of the checks, not just the one who bandages your knees. He said, I want that. I want to know you, the real you, not the one I made up in my head to make it easier to ignore you. And I am not going to rescue you from your own choices, I said. Not ever again. I will love you till the day I die, but I am done cleaning up after grown men. What we build from here, you build too. And you keep, and you value for what it is and not for what it might get you. If you can live with that, then we can try. He said he could. And I looked at him a long time, looking for the lie in it, the angle, the fear wearing love's coat, because I had gotten good at spotting it that year. And it was not there. What was there was just my boy, wrecked and honest and ready to do the hard work. And I decided that was enough to start with. Ren had her surgery 3 weeks later. She came through it strong, the way 3-year-olds do, like it was nothing, like she had not just cracked her whole family back open on her way to fixing her own heart. She is 5 now, and she runs down my Kalish Road in the spring with the bluebonnets up to her knees, and she calls me Gigi, and she has no idea, none, that the old woman she is running toward is the reason her daddy lived long enough to hold her the first time. Someday I will tell her. Or maybe I will not. Some things you do not do to be known for them. Emmett and I built it back slow, honest with the lines drawn clear. It is not what it was, and I would not want it to be, because what it was had a lie at the bottom of it. What it is now is smaller and truer, and it is mine chosen out in the daylight, and that is worth more than the whole soft, comfortable illusion I lived in for 40 years. The others I never did call back. Garrett and Bridget faded off into their own hard roads, and I wish them no ill and I keep no door open, and both of those things can be true at once. Some bridges the person burns themselves, standing right there watching it go up, and you do them no favors pretending they did not. So there it is, the whole of it. The old widow they told to go find a home turned out to hold every card at the table, and I know that is the part you came for. The part where the ones who threw me away found out what I was worth. But that was never really the story. That was just the noise. The story is the quiet that came after, and the one boy who came up my road at the end of it, and what a person chooses to do with power once they finally have it. Because here is what I learned, and if you take one thing from an old woman, let it be this. People spend their whole lives waiting to be seen. I stopped waiting a long time ago. The ones who measure your worth by what you give them will always find you worthless the day you stop giving. And that is not your failure. It is theirs. I built something with my own 2 hands in a barn nobody believed in. And I let a good man carry the name because the world would not hand it to a woman like me. And I do not regret the silence. What I regret is how long I mistook being needed for being loved. So do not you shrink yourself so somebody else can feel tall. Build something honest. And love the people who see you when your hands are empty, and let the rest of them go. That is not revenge. That is freedom. And freedom, it turns out, was worth more than every dollar they never got.